At a Christmas Eve dinner 2 years ago, my son-in-law's father spent an hour mocking my 40 years as an electrician, while my wife stayed silent and my daughter stared at her wine glass. When I finally spoke up, Derek looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you don't like my father's jokes, pay the bill and leave." So I did. I smiled, paid every cent of that check, and walked out into the cold alone. What none of them knew was that the walk to my truck wasn't a retreat. It was the first step of a decision that would quietly unravel everything they thought they had on me. My name is William Carter. I'm 68, a retired electrician with 40 years of calluses and not one regret about how I earned them. That night I drove 40 minutes through Christmas traffic in my good Navy coat to meet my daughter Emily, her husband Derek, and his father Frank at some seafood place downtown that charged $18 for a glass of wine. The moment I walked in, Derek looked me up and down and announced to the table, loud enough for our neighbors to hear, that he'd expected me to dress up more for the occasion. Frank laughed on cue. My daughter looked at her glass. My wife Dorothy's hand tightened on the stem of hers, but she said nothing. It only got worse from there. Frank spent the appetizers needling me about my little projects around the house, about crawling through attics and junction boxes, about how there was a ceiling to a trade like mine while real estate, his business, and now Derek's, had no ceiling at all. I gave him steady, even answers. I told him most people couldn't do the work I did. I told him the sky has limits too, depending on the weather, which actually got a real laugh out of him. But Derek wasn't laughing. Derek was recalculating. By dessert, he'd decided to say the thing he'd apparently been building toward all night. He asked if I ever felt embarrassed showing up to a place like this, in that coat, 18 years old, the one I wore to my brother's funeral, to my daughter's college graduation, to the courthouse the day she married him. I told him no. It didn't bother me at all. He smiled like he'd won something. Then he went further. He said, calmly, without raising his voice, that a man who spent his life in other people's attics, who smelled like solder and circuit breakers, didn't belong at a table like this, that I lowered it, and everyone there knew it even if nobody would say it. Frank studied the tablecloth. Emily's face went pale and empty. Dorothy started to object and Derek cut her off. If I wasn't comfortable, he said, no one was keeping me. So I stood up, put on my coat, and asked the waiter for the check, the whole table, $411 with the tip. I paid it, told them Merry Christmas, and asked Dorothy if she was coming home. She asked for a few more minutes. I looked at my daughter, who couldn't meet my eyes, and I walked out alone into the parking lot, into a black, moonless sky, and sat in my truck for a long moment before I turned the key. Somewhere on the drive home, between the second light and the bridge over Miller Creek, something settled in my chest that hadn't been settled in years. Not peace exactly, something firmer, a decision. Christmas morning I was up at 5:30 out of 40 years of habit, coffee made, eggs eaten alone, sitting on the porch in the navy coat watching the neighborhood wake up. My friend Ray Donahue came through the side gate with cornbread his wife Maggie had made 3 batches of before she was satisfied. Ray's the kind of man who can sit in silence for 6 hours without needing to fill it, so when I finally told him what Derek had said, that I lowered the whole table, that everyone there agreed, he just stopped chewing and listened. Then he told me plainly, that wasn't a reflection of my worth, it was a reflection of theirs. I told him the worst part was that I was still financing it. The insurance, the phones, the contractor bills for their house. I'd been subsidizing the very people who told me I didn't belong. He asked if I planned to keep doing that. I told him no. I didn't think I was. The day after Christmas, Maggie came by with chicken soup while I worked in the garage, and a neighbor snapped a photo of us on the porch for the community Facebook page. Within the hour, Emily was calling in a panic, worried that Derek's business contacts would see it and start asking questions about why I was sitting with another man's wife instead of my own family. I told her that last night her husband had informed a restaurant full of strangers that I lowered the quality of any table I sat at, and tonight, she was calling me about a bowl of soup. She didn't have an answer for that. 2 days later, Dorothy left with an overnight bag to help Emily with some things, and I sat down at my desk with the household ledger I'd kept for years, and finally looked, really looked, at what I'd been carrying. Derek's truck and Emily's car had been on my auto insurance for over a decade, $420 a month. Their phone lines were on my family plan, another $180. And for 4 years I'd had an open account with a contractor named Bud Holloway, authorized to bill me directly for anything done at their house. $840 a month, not counting the cash, the checks, the things I'd never bothered to track. I made 3 phone calls and 2 clicks online. Insurance removed. Phone lines separated. Contractor authorization revoked, effective immediately. I wrote the date in my notebook and 3 words beneath it: auto insurance, mobile carrier, contractor. Then I closed the book and went out to the garage, because I had a bookshelf to build for Maggie, and the wood doesn't wait on anybody's feelings. At my grandson Tyler's 9th birthday in January, I brought him a go-kart I'd built by hand. Solid pine, real rubber wheels, painted red because he'd once told me red was the fastest color. He lit up in a way no store-bought gift had ever managed. Derek saw it, smiled that camera-ready smile, and steered Tyler off toward his mother. Then he pulled me aside with a leather portfolio under his arm and told me about a mixed-use development deal he was closing. Strong returns, financing mostly in place, except the bank wanted a co-signer on the note. $480,000. I told him I already knew what was in that portfolio before he opened it. I crouched down, told my grandson I had to go, promised I'd see him soon, and told Derek the answer was no. It had been no before he asked. By spring, I found out exactly how deep the dependency ran. Tyler mentioned, entirely without agenda, that their furnace had gone out, and a repairman quoted Derek $4,200 to replace an old, badly wired panel. The same panel I could have fixed in a weekend for the cost of parts. He asked me, with 9-year-old logic that cut straight through every excuse the adults had built, why his dad hadn't just called me. I didn't have a good answer for him either. His mother had told him not to ask me for anything while things were unsettled. Tyler took my hand anyway, the way kids do, for no reason except that he wanted to. Then came tax season, and the discovery that actually changed everything. Sorting through old files, I found a limited financial power of attorney I had no memory of signing with intention. A document Derek had brought by 2 years earlier, disguised as an insurance form, asking for my signature while I was mid-project in the garage. It named him as agent over a personal savings account I rarely checked. $6,400 had quietly disappeared from it over 8 months, funneled through an account I didn't recognize. I sat with that number the way I used to sit with a bad short in a wall. No panic, just isolate the fault and fix it. I called Ray for a lawyer's name, called the bank to close the account and move what remained into one with my name only, and filed the document away with a label in my own hand: documentation. The window on his authority had already expired, but the theft had happened while it was active. I didn't need to make it a court case. I just needed my name off anything he could touch again. That spring also brought something better. A project director named Carol Bennett called me out of nowhere. Ray had given her my name, asking if I'd consult on a 400-unit residential grid retrofit. 6 months, $85,000, because she wanted someone who'd actually done the work, not someone who'd only managed people who had. I told Dorothy. She lowered her pruning shears and looked at me like something in her had finally settled too. When I told Ray the number, he laughed the kind of full, delighted laugh I hadn't heard directed at me in months, and told me Maggie had already said out loud that Frank Walsh could take his pocket square and consider what it meant that a retired electrician had just out-earned his whole retirement fund in half a year. In June, Dorothy finally said what she'd needed to say since Christmas. On the back porch, in the gold evening light, she told me she should have come home with me that night, that she'd chosen the path of least resistance and called it keeping the peace, when really, it was just not choosing, and that not choosing had been the wrong choice. She was sorry, completely and without qualification. I told her it was a start, and a good one. I also told her plainly that I would take care of her for the rest of my life, gladly, because that was the promise I made 43 years ago. But I would not give Derek Walsh another dollar, another co-signature, another authorization. Not ever again, she said she wasn't asking me to. 2 weeks later, Derek and Emily came to the house together, which told me whose idea the visit was. Derek opened with an apology that hit all the right notes and none of the right feeling. Emily's was different. Her voice cracked, her hand pressed to her collarbone the way it had since she was a girl trying not to cry, and I believed every word of it. I told my daughter we would always be all right. Then I told my son-in-law the truth. He hadn't come because he was sorry about Christmas Eve. He'd come because the money had run out, and he was hoping a bouquet from the grocery store could reset an arrangement that had ended the moment he told a restaurant I lowered its quality. I told him he was a capable man with a real career who deserved to actually use it instead of working every angle around it. He left quieter than I'd ever seen him. It was, I thought, the first honest moment he'd shown me in 11 years. That summer, Dorothy and I sold the house. Not out of spite, not because of Derek, because a 4-bedroom house built for a young family didn't match the load 2 people in their late 60s were actually carrying anymore, and I'd spent 40 years knowing the difference between a panel that fit and one that didn't. It sold in 5 days to a young couple with a 4-year-old, and I shook the husband's hand in the driveway and thought about being 37 in that same spot with Emily on my shoulders. We moved into a smaller place with a south-facing balcony where Dorothy grows herbs in terracotta pots. On moving day, Derek stood across the street watching the truck get loaded, and when I caught his eye over the roof of the car, he raised a hand, not quite a wave. I gave him a single nod. Not forgiveness, just an acknowledgement that I'd seen him standing there. By December, almost a year to the day since that dinner, I was sitting on that balcony with Ray and 2 cinnamon rolls he'd brought without asking, watching a maintenance man string lights through the courtyard trees, one careful strand at a time. Frank Walsh had moved back to Cincinnati after Derek finally stopped covering his expenses. That particular performance had run out of runway on its own. Emily called every Sunday now, steadier each time. Derek had sent one quiet text saying he wanted to talk when I was ready. I hadn't answered yet. I wasn't in a hurry, and I wasn't holding a grudge either. He'd get there, or he wouldn't. My phone rang mid-morning. Tyler, on video, hair going every direction, thrilled about the real Douglas fir his father had let him pick out himself. He asked if Dorothy and I were coming for Christmas Eve. I told him we'd see. He told me a Douglas fir could live 1,000 years if nobody cut it down, then decided he felt a little bad about it, and I told him he'd given it a good purpose. That's not a bad way for anything to go. Then he ran off to help his mother with the ornaments, the way children move on from the things that matter most before you're ready for them to. I sat there afterward with my coffee going cold, looking at Dorothy's small potted tree strung with white lights, and I thought about everything that had happened in the 12 months between one Christmas Eve and the next. I thought about the coat, the check, the tulips coming up along a fence that wasn't mine anymore, Tyler's hand in mine by the garden bed, Dorothy's face in the firefly dark admitting what she should have done differently, Ray's laugh when I told him what Carol Bennett was paying me. I was 68 years old with a balcony that caught the morning sun, a wife who still circles seed catalogs in November, a best friend who shows up with cinnamon rolls he never has to be asked to bring, and a grandson who feels bad about Christmas trees. I'd held the line. Quietly, without apology, without losing anything of myself in the process. I wasn't a perfect husband or father. I stayed quiet too long. I wrote checks when I should have drawn boundaries, and I mistook that generosity for love long after it had stopped being either. But if you've ever sat at a table where you were tolerated but not respected, I want you to know you're allowed to leave it. You're allowed to stop funding people who treat what you give them as something owed rather than something offered. Dignity isn't something anyone hands you. It's something you choose to protect, one quiet decision at a time. And some nights, that decision looks like nothing more than paying a bill, putting on your coat, and walking out into the cold exactly the way you came in, steady and still yourself.